This was a prison made for inmates who they lose control of. They're killing people in other prisons. They don't know how to manage them. They don't know what to do with them.
Mexico did the unthinkable, dumping 150,000 of its deadliest cartel members onto a single island. No guards, no rules, just chaos. But that chaos didn't stay contained. It started bleeding back into Mexico, unleashing consequences no one saw coming. Here's the full breakdown. The Hell Island Experiment. This is the kind of story that makes your stomach twist. A government experiment that looks less like justice and more like hell itself. From the very first day, chaos exploded. Cartel leaders who once controlled entire cities now had to fight like caged animals for scraps of food. Old rivalries between the Sinaloa Cartel, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, and Los Zetas reignited instantly. Within hours of arrival, the island wasn't a prison, it was a battlefield. But the shocking part, this wasn't just punishment. According to US and Mexican officials, this was a strategy, an experiment to let cartels tear each other apart in isolation, while the government watched from drones circling above. And tonight, we're pulling back the curtain. Because the question isn't just what happened on that island, it's what they don't want you to know. Mexico has been at war with cartels for decades. You've seen the headlines: entire towns terrorized, police assassinated, fentanyl pouring across borders, and despite arrests and extraditions of high-profile bosses, like the recent extradition of Mexican cartel leaders to the US, the violence never stopped. The cartels adapted, they evolved, they turned into militarized forces with their own tanks, their own drones, even their own armies. US military analysts warned that these groups are no longer just narcos, they're terrorist armies capable of destabilizing an entire region.
Picture this, it's 0300 hours, a Jalisco cartel safe house in Tijuana's outskirts is quiet. A SEAL team, 6 operators, fast rope from stealth MH-60 Blackhawks, silent as death.
That's the level of force required to even dent these organizations. But here's the dirty truth. For every high-profile raid, a dozen new leaders rise up. Every time one fentanyl lab goes up in flames, another 3 open across the border. Mexico's government was running out of options, and so came the idea of the Hell Island. On paper, it looked simple. Round up 150,000 of the most violent cartel members, lieutenants, enforcers, hitmen, and send them to an island compound designed to contain them indefinitely. No one leaves, no guards inside, no rehabilitation programs, just walls, watchtowers, and the Pacific Ocean. But in reality, it was a social experiment with echoes of ancient Rome. Imagine throwing lions into the Colosseum and locking the gates. The spectators were the politicians and military strategists who hoped cartel-on-cartel warfare would destroy these groups from the inside out. Day 1 footage leaked from a surveillance drone showed exactly what everyone feared. Gangs immediately split along cartel lines. Jalisco hit squads began fortifying an old prison block. Sinaloa crews carved out turf near the island's docks. Smaller groups like the Gulf Cartel were caught in between, and within 24 hours their bodies were hanging from makeshift nooses strung up as warnings. This wasn't a prison, this was a war zone. The most shocking part? US intelligence knew this was going to happen. In fact, they counted on it, because as long as the cartels were killing each other inside the island, the streets of Mexico's cities were quieter than they had been in decades, at least for a while. But here's where the hypocrisy burns. Publicly, both US and Mexican officials claimed this was about public safety. They called it a containment strategy. But behind closed doors, the Pentagon saw Hell Island as something else, a live testing ground. Remember, the US military has been experimenting with advanced drone warfare for years. According to combat veterans breaking it down, the same tech used against terrorists in the Middle East, stealth drones, AI targeting, anti-drone interceptors, was now circling above the island, tracking every skirmish, every improvised weapon, every cartel strategy. In other words, this wasn't just punishment, it was surveillance, it was research, it was wargaming in real time. And that's when the first big revelation hit the public. A leaked military memo suggested that some of the drones circling Hell Island weren't just observing, they were intervening, targeting cartel leaders with surgical precision when factions gained too much power, tipping the scales to keep the war balanced. That's not justice, that's manipulation. That's a government orchestrating a bloodbath and calling it security. And it gets darker, because while officials framed this as a bold new solution to cartel violence, human rights groups immediately sounded the alarm. How do you justify dumping 150,000 people on an island with no trial, no due process, no chance of rehabilitation? Even if many were killers, smugglers, and extortionists, Thousands were low-level foot soldiers, kids recruited at gunpoint, drivers forced into service, women trapped in cartel structures with no way out. To the outside world, Hell Island was being sold as a necessary evil, but to those trapped inside, it was nothing less than state-sanctioned extermination. And here's where you need to pay attention, because the story doesn't end with Mexico. The US was watching closely, very closely. With fentanyl overdoses killing more Americans in a decade than the Vietnam War claimed in combat deaths, lawmakers in Washington began to see Hell Island as a template. If it worked in Mexico, why not replicate it elsewhere? Why not build more containment zones for enemies too difficult to fight conventionally? That's when the whispers started. Was Hell Island the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one where nations create isolated zones to let enemies destroy themselves? If so, Mexico may have just unleashed something far bigger than it can control. That's the setup. But stay with me, because what happens next inside Hell Island will make your jaw drop. Rival cartels start building their own armies. Makeshift prisons turn into fortresses, and the shocking alliances that form inside the island will shake Mexico's power structure to its core. And worst of all, some of the cartel leaders aren't just surviving, they're thriving, and they may be planning an escape that could bring all-out war back to Mexico's mainland. This is the part the government hoped you'd never hear.
That's a chilling comparison. Think about it. Hell Island was chaos, but at least you could see the enemy. ADX Florence? That's psychological warfare disguised as incarceration. Which do you think breaks a person faster? Violence on the outside or silence on the inside?
But before we dive into the island's darkest secrets, we need to understand what happens when cartel bosses get captured alive, because their fate in America's most brutal prison makes Hell Island look like a vacation resort. El Chapo's living nightmare in America's Alcatraz. While 150,000 cartel members were tearing each other apart on Hell Island, the most notorious drug lord in history was experiencing his own version of hell. But this one was designed, engineered, and perfected by the American government. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, extradited from Mexico to the US in January 2017, wasn't just sent to any American prison. After his conviction on 10 counts, including drug trafficking and conspiracy to commit murder, he was transferred to the most secure, most isolated, most psychologically devastating facility on Earth, ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. And what happened to him there makes the chaos of Hell Island look merciful.
This was a prison made for inmates who they lose control of. They're killing people in other prisons. They don't know how to manage them. They don't know what to do with them. This is where you end up. This is the max, the super max.
ADX Florence was built in response to violent incidents in other federal prisons, a place specifically designed to house terrorists, spies, and organized crime leaders who were considered too dangerous for conventional incarceration. The facility spans 50 acres of remote Colorado desert, with no successful escapes in its history. But here's what makes this place truly horrific. It wasn't built to rehabilitate, it was built to break the human spirit. El Chapo is housed in a cell that's 7 by 12 feet, smaller than most people's bathrooms. The walls are poured concrete. The furniture is immovable concrete slabs. There's a tiny window, 3 feet high by 4 inches wide, deliberately positioned so he can't see the landscape or other inmates. Just a slice of sky or a brick wall.
There's a shower in the room. There's a concrete slab coming out of the wall. They give you a plastic mattress that's about 1 inch thick, if that. No pillow. And you would just stay in this room. Your food would come.
He spends 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, with no contact with other inmates. His meals are delivered through a slot in a steel door. When he showers, it's inside his cell. When he exercises, it's alone in an individual outdoor cage, a small, enclosed pen, surrounded by high walls and barbed wire, where he's shackled in leg irons, handcuffs, and belly chains. But the psychological warfare is even more brutal. The prison is designed to be completely soundproof. There's no ambient noise from other inmates. The silence, as one former ADX inmate described it, is deafening. Guards monitor him constantly via cameras, checking on him every half hour without conversation.
The silence is deafening. There's no inmates across from one another. It's just one row of cells. There is literally no communication between us.
And this is where it gets truly insane. El Chapo is under Special Administrative Measures, SAMs, which impose extra restrictions on his communication to prevent him from directing cartel activities from prison. His phone calls are limited, and when they're allowed, there's a guard listening live with his finger on a button, ready to cut the call instantly. But here's what's truly horrific about El Chapo's situation. He's been reporting severe health deterioration, high blood pressure, anxiety, insomnia, auditory hallucinations, cognitive reduction, memory loss. He describes his conditions as torture, and medical experts agree that prolonged isolation like this causes permanent psychological damage. Think about this. El Chapo once controlled tunnels under the US-Mexico border, commanded armies of sicarios, and escaped from 2 maximum security Mexican prisons. Now, he's been reduced to a shell of himself, begging for 15-minute phone calls with his twin daughters.
Another thing that struck me was I was so lonely. It was pathetic. A nurse came. She was a good-looking woman. I met her a couple times. She came to me, and she came in that safe space. And she was going to give me a document. She talked to me for a little while. And I guess it was time for her to go. And she went to hand me the paper next to the bars. So when I put my hand to get the paper, I don't know what made me do this, but I grabbed her finger.
That's former mob underboss Sammy the Bull Gravano describing his own experience at ADX, and his desperation shows you what isolation does to even the most hardened criminals. Former ADX warden Robert Hood called the conditions worse than death. Amnesty International has labeled it inhumane and a violation of international standards. But here's the kicker, and this connects back to Hell Island in the most disturbing way.
You know, I see these programs in Guantanamo Bay. We have terrorists. And they are prisoners there. They have a soccer court. They eat the same meals the military eats. They have better doctors. These are terrorists.
The average stay in solitary at ADX is 8.2 years, and many remain indefinitely. El Chapo was transferred to ADX on July 19, 2019, which means he's been in solitary for over 5 years now, with no end in sight. And if the psychological breakdown isn't enough, there's something even more sinister. If inmates act out at ADX, they have what's called a hole within the hole, a concrete slab with restraint points where prisoners are strapped down completely nude, lying in their own waste until guards decide to hose them clean.
They have a slab, and there's little hooks where your feet are on the end, and 2 of them on top. So you'll lay there completely nude. Both of your feet are in those stirrups. Both your hands are. That's where you'll lay on a concrete slab. What happens when you gotta go to the bathroom or something? The guard will come over. Go ahead. Every couple of hours, we'll come and hose it clean.
This is what America does to cartel leaders who get caught. Not quick execution, not even traditional life imprisonment. Psychological destruction, engineered over decades, designed to reduce the most powerful criminals on Earth to broken, hallucinating shells of their former selves. El Chapo has repeatedly tried to get transferred back to Mexico under a prisoner treaty, but his requests have been denied. He's fired multiple lawyers and is now representing himself.
Let's zoom out for a second. Extradition sounds like justice, but what happens when it destabilizes entire regions? Removing dozens of leaders doesn't erase crime. It fragments it. Are we witnessing a strategy to end cartels or just scatter them like shrapnel?
Desperately fighting for basic human contact with his family. And this brings us to the most chilling part of this entire story, because while El Chapo rots in his concrete tomb, Mexico has just handed over dozens more cartel leaders to face the exact same fate. And what's happening to them, and what it means for the future of cartel warfare, is about to change everything you thought you knew about this war on drugs. The Great Extradition. While Hell Island was consuming cartel foot soldiers and El Chapo was deteriorating in his concrete tomb, the most significant transfer of cartel power in decades was happening right under our noses, and it's about to change the entire landscape of organized crime in North America. In February 2025, Mexico extradited 29 suspects in a single day, the largest handover in history. Then, in August 2025, another 26 were transferred. We're talking about 55 high-level cartel operatives, bosses, financial chiefs, sicarios, sicarios, and lieutenants all headed to the same destination, America's prison system. But here's what the mainstream media isn't telling you. This isn't just about justice. This is about systematically dismantling Mexico's criminal power structure and feeding it into America's most brutal correctional machine. Among those extradited was Rafael Caro Quintero, the narco of Narcos, accused of murdering DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena in 1985 and pioneering fentanyl trafficking. This is a man who spent decades evading capture, who once controlled vast territories of Mexico's drug trade, who commanded armies of sicarios. Where is he now? Likely in the same type of concrete cell as El Chapo, experiencing the same psychological breakdown, the same systematic destruction of his mind and spirit. But Caro Quintero is just the beginning. The list reads like a who's who of Mexico's criminal underworld: Sinaloa cartel managers, CJNG financial leaders, Gulf cartel enforcers, remnants of the Knights Templar, Pablo El Flaquito Huerta from the Arellano Felix cartel, Servando La Tuta Gomez from the Knights Templar, Abigail Gonzalez Valencia, the financial brain behind CJNG operations. And here's the truly disturbing part. Experts predict this mass extradition will create power vacuums and escalate violence in Mexico. When you remove dozens of high-level operators simultaneously, the remaining cartels don't just disappear, they fragment, they fight, they tear each other apart for control. It's Hell Island all over again, but this time it's happening across entire Mexican states. The timing isn't coincidental. Under Trump's second administration, cartels have been designated as terrorist organizations, and Mexico was under intense pressure to comply with US demands or face economic consequences. The message was clear: hand over the cartel leaders or we'll impose tariffs that will cripple your economy. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum denied it was a deal, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Mexico's fast-track extradition processes violated normal legal procedures, rushing through cases that typically take years to complete. But here's where this gets really dark. Most of these cartel leaders are headed to the same fate as El Chapo, not just federal prison, but ADX Florence or facilities like it. The US prison system now houses hundreds of extradited cartel members, many serving life sentences without possibility of parole. Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, son of CJNG leader El Mencho, was sentenced to life plus 30 years in September 2024. Osiel Cárdenas Guillén, former Gulf cartel leader, served 17 years before being released and immediately deported back to Mexico. And the psychological warfare doesn't end with solitary confinement. Many of these prisoners face special administrative measures that severely limit their communication, preventing them from coordinating with their organizations or even maintaining meaningful contact with their families. But here's the most chilling revelation. Some intelligence suggests that the US isn't just imprisoning these cartel leaders, they're extracting information from them. Think about it. You take the most powerful criminal minds in Mexico. You subject them to years of psychological pressure in solitary confinement. You offer them small privileges in exchange for cooperation. How many of these extradited cartel leaders have become intelligence assets? How much information about Mexico's criminal networks has been flowing into US databases? The recent extraditions even included family members of cartel leaders. In May 2025, 17 relatives of Ovidio Guzman, El Chapo's son, who was extradited in 2023, entered the US under protective deals. These aren't just arrests, these are coordinated intelligence operations designed to completely map and dismantle Mexico's criminal infrastructure. And meanwhile, back on Hell Island, something even more disturbing was happening. As the Mexican government continued its mass extraditions to the US, rumors began circulating that some of the most valuable cartel leaders weren't being sent to American prisons at all. Instead, they were being quietly transferred to the island, not as prisoners, but as intelligence assets, protected by the same government that had dumped 150,000 of their subordinates there to die. Picture this. While foot soldiers tear each other apart in the island's blood-soaked compounds, their former bosses are living in secure quarters, providing information about rival cartels, helping US and Mexican intelligence agencies map criminal networks and plan future operations. The prisoners had become the wardens, the condemned had become the judges, and the most terrifying part? It was working. Cartel violence in Mexico's major cities had decreased significantly since Hell Island's implementation.
And here's where it hits hardest. When governments start adopting the very methods of the criminals they're fighting, the moral high ground vanishes. So ask yourself, are we watching a war on crime, or the merger of crime and government under a different name?
and the mass extraditions began. But it wasn't because the cartels were weaker, it was because the survivors were being controlled by the very governments they had spent decades fighting. The war on drugs hadn't ended. It had evolved into something far more sinister, a war where the biggest criminals weren't destroyed but recruited, where governments didn't defeat organized crime but absorbed it. And as reports emerged of secret meetings between US officials and certain Hell Island residents, as intelligence operations expanded across the border, as more cartel leaders disappeared into the American prison system, one question became unavoidable. In this new war between governments and cartels, who was really winning? And more importantly, who were the real prisoners? The answer might be more terrifying than anything that happened on Hell Island itself. Because when governments start using the same tactics as the criminals they're fighting, when they create their own isolated zones of violence and exploitation, when they systematically break human minds in concrete boxes and call it justice, the line between law enforcement and organized crime doesn't just blur, it disappears entirely. And that's when you realize Hell Island wasn't an experiment in containing cartel violence. It was a preview of what happens when the most powerful governments on Earth decide that constitutional rights, human dignity, and the rule of law are luxuries they can no longer afford. The cartels may have lost this war, but in winning it, America and Mexico may have become something far worse than anything the Narcos ever imagined.